Welcome back. Today we are talking with Daniela Parker. Daniela, we had a great first segment there talking about a team of one and what things that we can do and what we can do to help our positions. Now let's shift a little bit and talk about organizational culture and the culture that we work within. How does that challenge and how can we address that? Because I know you provided some interesting points here as well. So, how do we deal with those kind of situations?
So I think from the culture can a lot of times make or break your attempts to be successful with implementing like a resilience program, right? Really, any of my areas, it can hinder it. And so the first point I would make is that you have to understand and take time to figure out where the culture is at in your organization, especially if you're new or if you were just handed this project, right? Because sometimes that's how it works. There's maybe an audit finding that the continuity plan needs some attention, and then you find someone who's going to do that as other duties as assigned, and here you go, figure it out. So understanding the culture and taking time without judgment, right? Like just look at what works, what doesn't work, what are some of the statements that you hear in meetings, right? If you hear it's always worked for us, that's an indication that you may be in a culture that's a little more resistant to change. If you're in a culture that's constantly chasing the shiny objects, that's something that you need to understand. And so just understanding the culture. It's important that you find that executive sponsor that will help you implement a program when your culture may be a little more resistant to change. And it has to be from the very top down. The board has to be at least informed, right? Your executive sponsor should be the one to say, board, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. And your executive sponsor doesn't necessarily have to understand all the details. That's kind of your job. You have to make sure you provide them with the selling points. And a lot of times that's what we do, right? We're like salespeople. Like I said,
Hmm.
sometimes I feel like I'm a used car salesman because I have to kind of sell the value that I bring to the table or that what I do brings to the table. And that's really the way to get some of the buy-in in the organization. But sponsorship, I would say, is like number one. Because if you don't have support from the top down, you're not going to get any budget. You're not going to get the actual support that you need to be successful. And so I would say it's the sponsorship piece first and foremost. Another piece I found successful is the integration into strategy. So again, people look at resilience as an operational component of the organization. But when we look at what some of the strategic risks are out there, a lot of them are related to what we work on in the resilience space. So if I had to look at large strategic risks right now, so risks that can knock the strategic plan off the tracks, we have cyber. That's a big one, right? If an organization experiences a cyber event, that will cost you a lot of money, derail a lot of your projects probably, and that's where resilience then comes in and is a strategic risk mitigant. Another one is climate change, right? Really having foresight and saying, how is the change in weather patterns? How is this all going to impact us from the strategic level? And then where does resilience come in? And that's what I use a lot in the risk management space, is understanding that risk management isn't about what we don't want to do or what we can't do. It's about how we do it, and we consider what could blindside us, or we consider what the risks are that it brings to the table. And so I think that integrating into the strategic management piece of the organization, again, if you're not at the executive level, your executive sponsor should be the one that says, let's bring you to the table, because we do a lot of strategic planning. We don't do a lot of strategic risk management. And again, looking at some of the big strategic risks, they tie directly to what you're doing in the resilience space. But you have to connect the dots for the organization, because a lot of times people don't even see the dots. But
Right.
that's one of the strengths that I think we have in the resilience space, is because we have to see the organization as a whole, and we kind of know how it all links up. So bringing that to the table and really saying, here's the strategic value that what I do brings. Most organizations are technology heavy. Again, back to what happens if that vendor goes down, right? what could potentially happen? How much money is it going to cost us? And then is that money we can't spend on our strategies? I always found that once you link to strategy, people will start listening, especially on the executive level, because that's the world they live in, right? They're in the strategic realm of things. And so really trying to connect what you do to the overall achievement of strategic goals, to me, is a big one in working with the culture that you're in.
So you're kind of being proactive rather than reactive,
Oh,
because
yes.
a lot of people see business continuity and disaster recovery, emergency management, everything, all of that, even risk,
Yeah.
as responding to an event. But
Yes, they do. And it's not,
yeah,
right? So when I look at the strategic planning process, we build out all these strategies and we don't think about A, what could derail the strategies, and B, what are some of the risks that the strategies bring to the organization. So if we have a technology heavy strategy, there's a lot of risk that comes to the organization, right? If we all of a sudden have 20 extra vendors, the portfolio, everything increases. Where's the resilience piece to that? Are we prepared to respond if there's a problem? And so proactively saying, here's what you need to consider with this strategy in order for you to be successful, right? Again, to your point, I know we have the plans and I know we kind of are ready to react, but why not proactively reach out and say, I want you and your strategies to be successful, and here's how I'm going to contribute. And here's how I'm going to make sure that you know what to consider. And, especially budget, right? We have to probably plan for that, and it might cost some money. So let's do that now rather than when we have an incident and then we have no money. So that's a really big one for me, is to bring that value to the table. I sometimes refer to my department as the decision-making support department, because that's truly what we do, right? Like, we help make these decisions and we help make the organization successful. But to your point, that's not how people perceive business continuity, disaster recovery, right? So again, back to, you have to talk about that. You have to ask for, like, can I be part of this? How are we going to talk about strategic risk? And just ask that question when you're in a strategic planning session. Have we thought about the strategic risk piece? And then sometimes it's, well, we're going to do that later. You're never going to do it. Let's do it now, right? Let's make it part of the whole conversation.
I like what you mentioned there, because you said that in the notes, and I was going to ask you about it. Decision-making support department approach.
Yep.
So changing the, I guess when you said that, I was thinking, okay, changing all these documents and huge binders and all these procedures and things that people don't have time to read when a real situation occurs.
Yes.
But being able to be there to as a support for everybody.
Yeah, so the decision-making support happens a lot on the risk side, but again, also from a resilience perspective, people want to make good decisions, right? And we know that emotional decision-making is not the best way. We get all that, but a lot of times people don't necessarily have the right perspective because they focus on their own area, right? We also deal with a bias when it comes to decision making, that optimism bias that we often experience in the resilience space, where people are like, this will never happen here, right?
Oh.
We have a tendency to underestimate how bad
people
it can
never
actually
think
get.
like that.
Right. But they do. And so being part of the decision to say, actually, there is a likelihood, and then here's what the potential impact would be, quantifying some of the impact, right? How much would it cost us if we had an incident like that? And if we had a disruptive incident, how much would that cost us? And that's where people sometimes fall short when they have to make decisions for their areas, because that's not what they consider. They look at a ROI, right? But what about the other piece? What about if something doesn't work as intended? That will also cost you money, and that's not always part of that decision. And so that's where, from a cultural perspective, getting people in the habit of saying, have I considered everything in my decision? And have I looked at some of the, what I think will never happen? And I hear that all the time. This will never happen here, in
Yeah.
tabletops especially. I can say, don't fight the scenario as many times as I want. I always get that this is never going to happen here. Well, it could, right? So let's talk about it, and then let's outline what exactly would that look like. It's also sometimes I get the nickname Debbie Downer, but I try to overcome that with, let's also talk about some opportunities that come with that, right? There are opportunities that come with this. For example, for us as a credit union, what about member preparedness? What about the personal preparedness of our membership? If we can provide even just like a social media campaign that says, hey, September is National Preparedness Month, right? Here's some tips and tricks, like contributing to the community preparedness, especially in our space. We serve the underbanked, underserved, right? Those are marginalized communities that a lot of times we know in an emergency are the worst prepared. And that's where maybe we can do some good and really live into our mission. And that's where, again, you have to connect the dots for people and say, I am so much more than your fire drill captain. I bring so much more to the table. And that's how you change culture, because then you're not looked at as the obstacle or a budget item that nobody wants to pay or a regulatory requirement, right? Because that's the worst. That's where you're
Yeah.
looking.
Is that one of the challenges, I think, especially an individual who is just has the title of business continuity analyst, and that's it. They're the team of one, and they've got a culture where, oh, here comes Alex.
Yeah.
He always brings bad news. Our sales are great, our vendor relationships are great, whatever the case may be. Everything is rosy, bunnies and rainbows. But here comes Alex. And all he does is poke holes in everything. How do you go about kind of, I'm not trying to poke holes in everything. I want to help you keep those bunnies and rainbows, going.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's people just, I don't know if it's fear or what, but they don't want to talk about the negative stuff.
Well, we don't really like that, right? Like, I don't necessarily, outside of work, I don't necessarily like to talk about negative things, but then maybe we don't call it the negative, right? Like, maybe we say we just need to plan accordingly, right? And then use examples. Sometimes pulling examples of what can happen and what businesses have actually experienced can help, right? It doesn't have to be the doomsday thing. I will tell you that one of my worst nightmares was when one of our remote deposit capture vendors went down, where the mobile deposit piece did not work for 2 weeks. That's not necessarily a big natural disaster, but did that have an impact? Yes, absolutely. And we overcame that whole thing, and it was afterwards we had some really good lessons. It doesn't always have to be the big thing. It can be half your department is out sick today, because that does happen. And if you have small departments, again, if you're in a smaller organization, you have a lot of key people. That key person risk, that can really hurt. That can really hurt you. And it's not just when people are out sick, it's when people retire, that planning ahead and then using examples of, this is what one organization experienced. I'm trying to make sure we don't, right? And it doesn't always have to be the big stuff. It can just be, like I said, one key person retiring, and all of a sudden nobody knows how things work anymore because
Yeah.
nobody took the time to plan, right? Or even document and as is process. That happens a lot, especially in small shops, especially in small shops.
Is that way? It's interesting. You just mentioned that, sometimes it's not the big things, it's the little things. Is that a good approach then to look at the smaller things, to instead of trying to move the mountain, just try to move a couple of rocks at a time?
I think so, right? And that's, again, how you create some fans, right? Like, once you have that success story, once you are able to show one department how to maybe respond to something disruptive, how to plan for that key person to go into retirement, once you have small success stories, those are going to be your allies or your ambassadors, as I call them, right? And then rely on them and ask them, hey, I'm getting some pushback in this area. Would you mind reaching out to that manager or director and maybe sharing what we did and how it helped you, right? That's how you're going to change that culture, is to your point, like you move one rock at a time rather than looking at the entire big thing. Break it down, and really focus in, and you'll get a feel for where the departments are or where the people are that understand it a little better. And maybe they came from an organization that had this figured out and they're familiar with it. Your IT folks, a lot of times, I will tell you, starting with business continuity, one of the IT folks called me internal affairs. And I was like, why would you call me internal affairs? I am your way to budget money. Like, let's talk about this, right? It's like you and the budget, I'm in the middle here because I can make your case for budget money. That changed, the whole internal affairs thing changed pretty quickly after that. I was not internal affairs anymore. You have to kind of create that fan base of, I know they're coming and they're poking holes, but here's why, and here's how it helped us be better prepared. Here's how it helped us be more successful. Here's how it supported a strategy. That's kind of how you want to approach that. And that's how you change the culture, a little bit at a time.
Now, you've talked about ambassadors a few times and brought that up. But in the notes you sent me, you also talked about starting a committee. What were you referring to that? Is that the ambassadors, or is that a different group, or how does that work?
That can be your ambassadors. So committees, to me, I know for a lot of people, it's one more meeting, right? But one of the big issues from the risk side, as well as from the resilience side, is the silos in organizations. Like one department doesn't know what the other department's doing. Committees are a way to bring people together. So we had a risk management committee that was operational risk. Those were the operational heads. They got together once a month. We talked about what's going on in the organization, what's going on outside of the organization, right? What's impacting us regulatory wise, what's happening in the communities that could impact us. And then breaking down those silos and understanding that I can't make a good decision if I don't know how the organization as a whole operates. We see this all the time, right? We see it when in projects when the stakeholders aren't all at the table, and then at the end of the project we wonder why this was not successful. Well, because you didn't bring the right people to the table. So committees are a way to do that. The business continuity planning team was a good way to do that, where it was like, let's talk about it. And we even prepared for like if we had a big update at the end of the year to the core system, for example, we got together ahead of time, the entire team, not just IT, because in the past it was just IT. We brought everybody together. We said, we will help you test. We will make this a more coordinated effort. Everybody will understand what the release is, how it impacts us, what may not work the next day. And so bringing everybody together and understanding that when IT does this, I actually have some input, right? Like I get to ask questions. I don't just get an email that says, big update. If something doesn't work, just call the helpline. And you're like, great. I'm just going to cross my fingers and hope that everything works. But proactively bringing everybody together and saying, let's talk this through and ask your questions now, right? And a lot of times there were things out there that IT didn't consider. So it was a collaborative effort. It was done in like a committee or team type setting, and it brought everybody to the table and it gave everybody input. And that's how you create that buy-in, and that's how you get your ambassadors or your allies, right? Because it came from the business continuity side. It said, let's work together and plan it.
You mentioned a really good keyword there, a couple actually: project management and stakeholder. I think those two are really key. Project management skills definitely help us at managing stakeholders.
Absolutely. And also being okay with not necessarily hearing the answer that you want to hear. So you have to be okay when you present something and you have it kind of figured out in your mind. If someone says, that's just not going to work for me, you have to be able to adjust, right? A lot of times I used to be the type I would just write my procedure or write whatever I need and then roll it out. I'm trying to be more agile about that and really get stakeholder input as I build it out so that in the end I have a better process. But again, it takes time. You learn. And that's the other thing. You're not going to be perfect from the get-go. You're going to do things that are going to completely backfire. And you're like, I'm just going to crawl under a rock for a day because that was not good, right? It's going to happen. Just learn from it and then move on. But, you know, that's, again, like bringing that value and making sure people know the value that you're bringing. That's how you change that culture. And I like the point you made about like, move one rock at a time, not like don't just focus on the entire mountain.
We have 2 minutes left. Do you want to take a minute for a final thought? I feel like Jerry
Yeah.
Springer. A final thought? Yeah.
I guess my message is always, if you're not the resilience professional or if you're not the risk professional and you're listening to this because you want to learn more, like be supportive, right? Like understanding that this discipline brings a lot of value to the table. And for the resilience professionals, you just have to keep at it. I mean, I know I sound like very optimistic cheerleader kind of approach to it, but that's what it takes. And you're sometimes just, you're going to get up in the morning and be like, here I go again. I'm going to get all these negative comments and you have to get over it. And you have to just continue to push that message, right? Eventually it will change.
Yeah.
If it doesn't, then you have to make some personal decisions. But I mean, that shouldn't happen too often, I would hope.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. You were the key to change that culture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Daniela, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and talking about how to deal with culture, because so many of us are just teams of one. So everything comes at us from every direction, and sometimes it's hard to deal with that. But you gave some great insights and direction. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, Alex.
My pleasure. Thanks again, and everyone watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody.
If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.